Okay, good. Well, my name is Karen Shipman, and I am the current president of the Society of Rice University Women, which is an organization which has come into the modern world, and we welcome everybody as members, regardless of gender. And we are happy to have so many participants and to be coordinating this event with the Houston Area Book Club. SRUW was started in 1968, and I'm not sure when the book club came into existence, but I want to welcome Susan Ellis, who's the president of the Houston Alumni Book Club, and I want to welcome our speaker, Jennifer Latson, and welcome all of you who are here with us tonight. This is our very first event for this year. We have a series of lectures in the fall and in the spring, and I hope you will join us as we move along through the year. I'd like to now turn the program over to Piper Matlin, who is the coordinator tonight. Piper, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody, and thank you to, I think it's actually considered the Rice Virtual Book Club. And Susan, would you like to say anything about the book club?
We went virtual when after COVID started, and some of us who did not live in the Houston area were then able to join, which has been fabulous. We're now international. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, for example, and we look forward to any and all participating. We meet once a month on, let's see, what day is it? Wednesday, your time, Thursday morning, my time. So Wednesday evenings, and just watch for listings that come out through the Rice Alumni News and on the calendar, and join us anytime a book takes your fancy. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's great to see a lot of people from the book club here as well as so many SRUW members, so thank you. So our author tonight is Jennifer Latson, and I believe you go by Jenny, is that right? And The Boy Who Loved Too Much was her first book that was published in 2017, and she's a Houston-based journalist, and she is the editor of Rice Business, which is the alumni magazine for Rice's Jones Graduate School of Business. And also, she's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe, Time, and other publications. And she's actually a regular feature writer for Psychology Today. And she has an English degree from Yale University and an MFA in creative writing from the University of New Hampshire. And so we welcome her. She's got a lot of things to talk to us about around this book, The Boy Who Loved Too Much. Thank you, Jenny.
Sure. I'm not muted. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, so I guess what I was thinking I would do is just kind of talk about how the book came about and how I got to know this amazing family that I wrote about. And I'm assuming most people maybe aren't familiar with the book, so I'll just kind of give an overview. But so here's the book. I had never heard of Williams syndrome until about 10 years ago, and I was a reporter at the Houston Chronicle at the time, but I was actually driving home from work, listening to NPR, as you do, and they had a story about Williams. So that's how I heard about it for the first time. And the story was about how Williams is this rare genetic disorder, and the people who have it have no social inhibitions. They're extremely outgoing. They're driven to connect with other people, and they can really just approach anyone and win them over and charm them with small talk. And so in this NPR story that I was listening to, the reporter goes to meet a family that has a little girl with Williams. And the little girl, I don't know if you guys heard this or remember it from that long ago, but there was this little girl and she meets the reporter for the first time, and she comes up with a song for her on the spot. And it's something like, you're so sweet and beautiful. You're my best friend in the world. It was like, my first thought was just, this is amazing. How is this even a disorder? And also, like, how can I get some of that? Because I'm an introvert. It's very hard for me to talk to strangers. I'm still kind of figuring out small talk. And just to have the courage to go up to someone and say, like, hey, you seem really cool. Let's be friends. We're friends now. That really sounded like a gift to me. But also, I thought, how terrifying to just love everyone and trust everyone instantly. And there's like a reason that most of us don't do that. And not only do you, risk social rejection, but also you really risk being taken advantage of, exploited, abused. So when I heard that story, I was actually already leaving the Chronicle to get my MFA in creative writing. So I kind of had in my head that I wanted to work on a book during the MFA program. So this was just like a lightning bolt of what an amazing topic. Of course, I need to explore this. And so, I mean, on the one hand, I think the science really grabbed me because it's such an interesting, just genetic disorder. So it's a very rare gene deletion that causes Williams, and only 1 in 10,000 people are born with it. And it's just by chance. There's no sort of demographic correlation. There's nothing you can do to get it or not get it. It just sort of happens during conception. And it's a small deletion. It's called a micro deletion because it's only about 24 missing genes from the 30,000 that are in the genome. So that actually has made it really attractive to geneticists because it's such a small sort of area to study and such a huge kind of observable phenotype. So you have the personality, the Williams personality, and that extreme extroversion, but there are also physical features that go with Williams. So people with Williams tend to have what is described as an elfin look. So they have like very narrow chins, kind of prominent ears, a stellate, a star pattern in the eyes. They're very cute looking. And a lot of them, I mean, they tend to look more like each other than they do the people in their families. So there's also kind of a unique intellectual disability where their visual spatial skills are really impaired, but their language skills are relatively intact. And so they're able to really, they're creative, they can tell stories, they can obviously win people over with small talk. So that's kind of a conflict in the brain. And then also a lot of people with Williams have a lot of musical talent. So they all tend to be very musical. Some of them are, gifted musically, some of them have perfect pitch. So there's just kind of a lot going on in this small micro deletion. So that was all really interesting, but really my focus was kind of on the human side of what does it mean to live with this disorder? How can you become an independent adult, grow up, protect yourself, not be taken advantage of if you don't have that kind of innate sense of skepticism and self-defense that the rest of us have. So I wanted for the book to focus on a single family of a kid with Williams who was kind of right on the cusp of adolescence, because I thought it would be really interesting to document coming of age with Williams. So to do that, I got involved with, there's a Williams Syndrome Association, the National Association, and they have regional branches and they do a lot of activities and events for people, the Williams community. So I just started going to events and talking to people, and I met Eli, who is the boy who loved too much, and his mom, Gail, and we just clicked. And, it's easy to fall in love with like any kid with Williams, and he just especially was so endearing, and his mom and I really got along. So she's a single mother, and so she kind of became the main character of the book even more than Eli, because I think even though they were both going through a challenging time together, the stakes were a lot higher for her because she kind of knew what could go wrong if she didn't, kind of provide the right buffer for him. So for her, there was like this challenge of negotiating the line between overprotecting him, maybe ruining the risk of him having sort of a normal childhood and making the friends he was so eager to make because she's sort of always hovering nearby. But then on the other hand, sort of, if she gives him too much space, she's going to get bullied or she doesn't know what's going to happen. So, so that was kind of a challenge for her to navigate how to help him find his way in the world. So I followed them for 3 years from the time that Eli was 12 to 15. And I just spent a lot of time with them at home, went to family gatherings with their extended family. Eli is involved in a lot of sports leagues and extracurricular activities. And so I went to all of those with them. And I mean, I think that's sort of why Gail kind of became a hero to me, because it would have been a lot easier for her. And it was sort of her instinct to just like keep him at home, keep him where he's safe, where she can keep an eye on him. But she did want to give him the opportunity to have these social interactions and sort of learn how to navigate those appropriately. And especially because like that's his driving joy in life, is to engage with people socially. So, so that's kind of how I got to know these guys. And I was thinking I'll just read a little excerpt from the book that I think is kind of demonstrative of what their daily life was like. So this is a passage from the beginning of the book. And so this was the summer that I first started hanging out with them, and they were going to a summer camp just for kids with Williams syndrome that's in Michigan. So we actually drove from, they live in Connecticut. So we drove from Connecticut to Michigan for this summer camp. And this was something that happened along the way on a road trip. Gail didn't know where to turn. She'd been driving east for hours on an unfamiliar highway, I-80, in an unfamiliar state, Pennsylvania, searching with increasing desperation for a place to stop for the night. She'd been checking each exit since 9 p.m., but every reputable hotel from Clarion to Punxsutawney had been booked full. Now it was past 11. She tapped her crimson fingernails anxiously on the steering wheel. 12-year-old Eli was scribbling with crayons on a notepad in the back seat. His crayons were the fat kind that kindergartners used. Gail bought them because they were easier for him to grip than the slender version. He clutched a red crayon tightly in his fist and drew furious circles, throwing his full weight into the task. Then he lifted the crayon from the page and stabbed it rapid fire, a manic pointillist creating a fusillade of dots. A few tore through the paper. He lifted his artwork and admired it in the dome light, which Gail had left on for him. He chirped with glee, smiling to himself. Then he selected a blue crayon, bent his head over the notepad, and began again. As he worked, he sang a selection of hits from Disney's Lion King. Every few minutes, he asked enthusiastically, "When are we going to get to the hotel?" Road trips were a source of great excitement for Eli, since they meant a new cast of characters and new social opportunities he couldn't find at home. Home was a townhouse in a small Connecticut apartment complex where Eli and his mother lived by themselves. Eli's father hadn't been around for years. From his kitchen window, Eli often watched other boys his age playing in the parking lot. From the French doors overlooking his back patio, he caught glimpses of them shooting basketballs through the hoop behind the subdivision's communal grass patch. But he'd never joined them. Even if he'd been invited, Gail wouldn't have let him go. Road trips, however, meant stopping at diners and hotels, places where you could meet new people and see unfamiliar vacuum cleaners and overhead fans, to Eli's great delight. And this had been a nice, long summer road trip, 2 days north to Michigan and now 2 days back. Eli squirmed giddily in anticipation of all the adventures still in store. "We'll be there soon, Eli," Gail said. Her voice was worried, slightly exasperated. She asked him to sing a little more quietly. It was nearly midnight and Eli was dozing when Gail finally found a motel with a vacancy, a low white brick building near an oil refinery in Clearfield, Pennsylvania. But as soon as she pulled into the parking lot, she was tempted to turn around and keep driving. The warm air drifting through her open window carried the acrid smell of diesel fuel on a cloud of cigarette smoke. The parking lot was filled with work trucks, around which men stood in groups dimly lit by streetlights. Tractor trailers lined the edges of the parking lot, bordering the motel like a menacing metal hedgerow. Gail considered getting back on the highway, If she drove all night, they could be home by morning. But she knew she was too tired. They were stuck here at the Clearfield Budget Inn. Eli woke up when the car rolled to a stop. He surveyed the landscape enthusiastically, oblivious to the seediness of the place. "I've never been here in a long time," he exclaimed, clapping his hands together. Gail stepped out of the car and into the July heat and opened the back door to let him out. She could feel the eyes of the men on her, the only woman in their midst, and on Eli, who was now rocking back and forth on his heels with excitement. Both Gail and Eli were rumpled from hours in the car. Gail, a youthful 41-year-old, wore a purple camisole and capri-length cargo pants that revealed some of her tattoos. On her back, feathery wings spread outward from her spine. Her left shin was covered with a series of colorful images. On the back, a dragonfly. On the left, flaming dice. On the right, a serpent coiled around a sword. And on the front, a red heart with a banner that said, Eli. Her long black hair, usually wavy, had gone limp in the muggy heat. She had pulled it up into a clip, revealing the discs that had stretched dime-sized holes in her earlobes. Eli wore a baggy t-shirt and the denim shorts that Gail had bought at Kohl's just before the road trip, hoping these wouldn't split at the seams like his last pair. She described her son as husky, but it was his pear shape that made him hard to shop for. Boys' clothes weren't designed with this shape in mind. She ran a protective hand through Eli's dark curls. His features were those of a much younger child, chubby cheeks, an upturned nose, a smile so wide it made his eyes crinkle. They were crinkling now. His face was bright with joy, and he tugged at Gail's arm, pulling her toward the light, the trucks, the men. She jerked him forcefully in the other direction. In the sweltering front office, the motel's owner, an Indian man with thinning white hair, slid open a thick glass window. Bulletproof, Gail thought. He looked as tired as Gail felt. She rummaged through her purse to find her wallet and handed him her credit card. Eli, meanwhile, bounced up from behind her, smiling broadly. "I'm Eli. What's your name?" he said, extending a hand to the motel owner. The counter was higher than Eli's head, but he stood on his tiptoes and strained to reach. The man gave him a quizzical look. Without answering, he reached through the window and shook Eli's hand. Turning to Gail, the motel owner nodded towards the parking lot. "Don't worry about those guys," he said. "They're here for the summer working construction. They just like to relax out there after work." Only slightly reassured, Gail took the room key. "He likes me," Eli declared as they left the office, pointing his thumb toward his own chest. "I'm sure he does," Gail agreed blankly. She was already scanning the row of doors for the number on her key. She slung Eli's backpack over her shoulder, rolling her suitcase across the uneven pavement with one hand and holding Eli's hand with the other. Eli peered at the faces of the men in the parking lot, hopeful that someone would return his gaze, but they looked away when he caught their eyes. One man lit a cigarette, another stubbed one out on the pavement. One man mumbled something too quietly for Gail to hear. The others laughed. Apart from the rest of the group, one man sat alone on the sidewalk, his elbows propped on bent knees, his head drooping heavily in his hands. His eyes were closed. Gail noticed his sinewy arms, his muddy work boots. Maybe he was just tired from a long day, but Gail's instincts told her he was more likely drunk or high. She looked for a way around him, but he was on the walkway just in front of her room. There was no other way to go. She whispered to Eli through clenched teeth, "Do not say anything to him." "Why?" Eli replied in a normal voice. They were about 10 feet from the man and closing in. Gail raised a finger to her lips. "Because he's sleeping." Eli's eyes never left the stranger. When they were less than an arm's length from the man, Eli shouted, "Are you sleeping?" I will say that no one was harmed in the making of that scene, although when the book came out, Gail's mom was like, "You didn't tell me that happened." But it's the kind of thing that would happen to them all the time when, it's like a person that you might think, "I better give this guy some space." Eli doesn't give anyone any space. He goes right up to people, he ambushes them, he tries to hug them. So that's sort of the challenge that Gail faced is you can't trust his judgment. But obviously she couldn't go to school with Eli. I mean, there's places where she can't follow him and shelter him. And so she had these horrible visions of, middle school with a disability. Are the other kids making fun of him? Are they bullying him? And then as puberty started to kick in, there was sort of a new level of complication where he's always been a hugger, but now he's hugging attractive women exclusively almost. And he's hugging them for too long and too intense of a hug. And so that was another part of coming of age was, his behavior is essentially the same. He's always hugged everyone and told them that he loves them. But that's something that's really cute and charming in a little kid that becomes less cute and charming when you're becoming a grown man. So, and also because he doesn't wait for, he doesn't really read the cues or wait for you to agree to a hug. He just kind of goes for it. And so Gail, was just worried that he's going to run up and hug a woman someday. She's not going to understand that this is just his thing. And she's going to punch him or call the police or pepper spray him. So there was sort of an extended period of behavioral modification efforts that were not super successful. There was a token system, there were social stories, and just everywhere we went, she was telling him, okay, no hugging, handshakes and high fives only. That was the rule. And so every time we go to a restaurant or something in the car before he's allowed to get out, she'd say, okay, handshakes and high fives only, right? And he'd say, got it, Mom. And then he gets out of the car and the first thing he does is just throw his arms around the first person he sees. And he would even say, handshakes and high fives only, as he's like ambush hugging a stranger. So you can tell that intellectually he gets it and he's immediately very sorry afterwards. But that drive is so intense for him that he can't stop himself. So that was really hard. And I will say, without spoiling it, that I think the book has a happy ending and Eli matured a lot more than I think Gail ever expected him to. And I think relationally, I mean, that's sort of like the kind of bitter irony of Williams is that these kids are so driven to make friends. They want friends so badly. They want that social connection and it's too much. I mean, they come on too strong, and especially in kids that age, it's so tricky to navigate those relationships. And so, you don't really get the reciprocity that Eli is looking for. But there's a chapter near the end of the book where Eli's 8th grade class has his science teacher ask Gail to come in to talk to the class because they're studying genetics. And so she wants Gail to come in and talk to the class about Williams syndrome. And Gail is nervous because teenagers terrify her anyway. And she's worried that telling them about Williams is just going to add fuel to whatever teasing they might be doing already. And so she comes in and she speaks to the class. And when she actually meets his classmates, it becomes obvious how much they just truly care about Eli. And they have these great questions about what his life is like. What's he like at home? Is he going to go to college? Is he going to drive a car? And, and talking about like ways that they've tried to include him and things. And so Gail was really shocked and touched and thinking, like, here I am thinking these kids are monsters and there's this Lord of the Flies situation happening. And actually, they're very sweet to him and they're protective of him in the same way that she is. And that, I think, really was what I found to be the case wherever we went, even when Eli is, to me, very inappropriate in approaching people and throwing himself at people and ambush hugging them. 9 times out of 10, people respond warmly and they kind of understand that there's something a little off about this kid and you can't immediately tell what it is, but they genuinely kind of light up that he's showing this genuine delight and attention to them. So I think that was a kind of a surprise to me, and I think a bit of a surprise to Gail too, that for the most part, even though his behavior catches people by surprise, they appreciate it and no one punches him or pushes him away. So I think they're just genuinely touched by him, and his kindness brings out the kindness in other people. So that was kind of my overview of the book. But should we do questions or?
Yes.
I have
Go
a
ahead.
question. Have you followed up after finishing the book, after completing the book? Have you followed up with them? Because you're right. It ended up on a very, I thought, upbeat note, and I was almost crying when I read how his friends reacted to her presentation. And I was just wondering, because now it's what, 3 or 4 years down the road, and so how he should be out of high school by now.
He is. I mean, he actually, so he was 12 to 15 when I was writing the book, but then it didn't get published for a few years after that. So he is now 22. So he is out of high school. My cat is just helping himself in this room. He is out of high school, and I talk to them all the time. So they are in Connecticut. So I was up in New England when I was working on my MFA, and now I'm back in Houston. But I talk to them on the phone, at least every other week, and he's doing awesome. I mean, I was really impressed. I think there was a little bit in the end of the book where he was doing a lot better at like having conversations with people and kind of drawing people out, and not only talking about, I think I just, tangentially mentioned he's really into vacuum cleaners and ceiling fans. And so, when I was spending time with them, he really wanted to talk to people about vacuum cleaners almost exclusively. And now he's better at like the last time I actually saw them in person, he talked to me, he was like, okay, well, today's Friday, so what are you doing this weekend? And I was like, okay, that's a good conversation starter. Like, he used to have, he would talk about vacuum cleaners, and then he would also have like certain compliments that he always used, like, I like your shirt. How'd you sleep was a big conversation starter, and they were kind of just not always appropriate. And so I think he's just getting a lot better at navigating that. The pandemic has been really hard for him because he's just been inside, and Zoom is not quite the same. I mean, he really craves that physical contact and face-to-face interaction. So that has been hard, but now he's kind of back into in-person stuff. So he now is in kind of a life skills training, vocational training program. And so he's doing, like different jobs, I guess they'll do for a little while. So he was like stocking shelves at a PetSmart, and he really liked that. And he's worked at like the soup kitchen. So yeah, so I think he's doing really well.
Do you think early intervention helped out? I mean, the fact that someone at her school noticed him early on, and so she got him diagnosed early, and so they started working with him. Do you think that helped, or is it just different levels of? I mean, he may be a higher functioning Williams disorder.
I think he's sort of mid-range, because I've also met some people that are really high functioning with Williams, and the IQ can range. I mean, his IQ, he tests at about 50, which is so hard to know, like, if that's really reflective of his true abilities, because he's so good at some things and so bad at others. But I think he's sort of mid-range for Williams, and I know Gail is really grateful that she did get that early warning, even though it was hard. And there were a lot of things that he was able to start earlier. It's hard to know how much that played a part. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the early warning is helpful for a lot of kids with Williams have aortic stenosis, supravalvular aortic stenosis. And so you have to really watch that. And he has it, but it's very mild and it's never been a problem. I mean, it can get worse, but I mean, that's more of an issue where you really want to know right away that this is something you have to look out for. But it's just so hard to know behaviorally. Like, I mean, that was kind of the time that I spent with them. She just felt like, I'm doing all these things, we're doing this token system, and we're doing all the, like, every book on behavioral modification. She was trying it, and it was like, it's not working. And then one day it did seem like it kind of clicked for him, and it was like, was that just a phase that you went through and now you're through it? But yeah, no, I'm sure it helped, but it's hard to say how much.
I would just like to say I loved this book. I'm a pediatrician. I found out about Williams syndrome in my residency at Baylor. And then I thought back to when I was a teenager and was babysitting, and I took care of this little child with a heart condition of some sort. And he was just always happy and delightful and just would come out of the bed. I'd put him to bed, come back, give me a hug, go back to bed, you know. And I've taken care of a number of kids over the years. But this book gave me so much insight about the syndrome. And I love the way you looked at how, you know, it may have developed. The picture of from Midsummer Night's Dream, I'm like, wow, all of that. I mean, this was a delightful book and so revealing to me. Thank you so much for this book.
Thank you. I didn't realize, I don't know how many people actually read it. Now I feel like I just give you guys an overview of a book you've already read, but I did think that elfin fairy tales, you know, maybe being based on real life people with Williams, that was so interesting to me because I can totally see it. It's like before genetics existed, you had to come up with a story for why people are so different, and the fact that they look more like each other than the people, you know, their parents. You might think, okay, well, elves brought this baby here, but yeah. But it is interesting too, like you say. I feel like looking back, there's somebody that I knew from my town growing up that probably had Williams, and it's like 1 in 10,000 people is very rare, but it's not that rare. And if there's somebody with Williams in your town, you're gonna know, you know, like they'll come up to you at the supermarket and introduce themselves. So it's definitely out there. So, and there's definitely, you know, when I moved back to Houston and kind of got connected with the Williams Syndrome Association here, there's lots of people with Williams in Houston because it's a big city. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you know what to look for, it's as obvious as seeing a child with Down syndrome or a person with Down syndrome. You know,
yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that's come up a lot with, you know, when I'm talking to other families of a kid with Williams, and like this woman that I know, she went on a cruise and there was a family on this cruise who had a kid, and the kid clearly had Williams, but she didn't really know if the parents knew, you know, because it's still, I think, underdiagnosed because not every pediatrician knows about it, or, you know, it's not one of the first things that you look for. And so, so she was like, should I break the news to this family, or, you know, what's the protocol here? So I do think that's tricky because it's obvious to people who know. And if you don't know, you would be like, what are you trying to tell me about my child? So.
Yeah, I wonder if it's, you know, the newborn screen encompasses so much. I don't know if Williams syndrome is part of what they screen for.
It's not on the standard one now. I feel like those are probably going to become the technology is getting so much more, you know, it's affordable to do a wider screen. And so I bet it will be at some point, but I don't think it is right now.
But thank you.
Julie, would you like to ask your questions?
Sure. So I'm very interested in your book because it's nonfiction and it raises a lot of questions for me. And among those is, how did you identify this family? How did you arrange to be able to shadow them? Were there any things that you had to set up to protect yourself or for them to protect themselves, like a contract or waivers or something like that? Just how did you go about working with this family who were really, I would say, putting a lot of trust in you that you were going to represent them fairly?
Yeah, and I was actually surprised when I first started, like, so the way I kind of approached it was top down. So I went to the head of the Williams Syndrome Association and said, I have a book in mind that I would like to write. And I didn't exactly know, you know, how I was going to structure it or anything, but I just said, I kind of want to focus on one family and tell a story of coming of age with Williams. Like, do you mind if I start showing up to these events, and can I talk to people and tell them, you know, this is the project that I'm working on, and are you interested in being involved? And everybody in the Williams community was so open to it. And that was my fear too, is like, I'm just going to start telling people like, hi, I want to come to your house. And like, spend time with you and your very vulnerable child and then like expose them, like tell their story to the world. But people were so open to it, and everybody that I talked to, the reaction was, well, we're trying so hard to get more attention for Williams syndrome because it's like a lot of people have never heard of it. And it's such an important thing to get awareness. So so pretty much everyone was open to the idea. And so I kind of had a very specific like demographic in mind, because I really wanted a kid who was around 10 to 12. And I thought that I wanted it to be a girl, just because I thought that would be, I'm looking at this issue of vulnerability and like learning to protect yourself. And that seemed like it would be very salient in a girl. And also that's what I knew from my experience. And actually, so the way that I met Gail and Eli was I met Gail first at like a luncheon for mothers of kids with Williams, and the kids weren't there. But Gail just really struck me because she was so self-aware and open. I mean, she just sort of tells her story very well, and I obviously needed her to tell her story to me. So so that was something that I was interested in, and then I told her, here's what I'm working on. And I told her, because at the time I was in grad school, and I was like, well, this will be my thesis for my MFA program, but then I'm hoping I can sell it as a book. And later she told me, she was like, if I really believed you were going to get a book deal, I might have been more cautious. But at the time she was like, oh, it's her school project, so sure, you can come over and shadow me. But there were other people that I had interviewed too, and other people that I kind of explained, like, what I want to do is immersion journalism. And I had come from, being a reporter at the Houston Chronicle and having done that on like a very small scale for, newspaper story length stories. And so this was like, I kind of described to people, like, I want to come to your house and just like sit around and watch you for like a year or more. And nobody said no, but sometimes I would, I'd come to someone's house and kind of explain, here's what I'm working on. And they would just like line the family up and say like, okay, now interview us. And I was like, no, I actually need to just like, you ignore me and I just like sit in a corner and you do your thing so that I can observe you. But Gail, for some reason, I also gave her books that were examples that I wanted to emulate. So I gave her The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I gave her one called Zaytun, which was Dave Eggers. I don't know if anyone read that. It was like after Hurricane Katrina, he kind of embedded with a family that was, really affected by the storm in New Orleans. Anyway, just immersion journalism examples. And so Gail really liked that, she was kind of on board with it artistically and thought that would be a good way to tell this story. And so she just kind of made, she was like, okay, when she would bring me somewhere, like we would go to family parties, she would be like, okay, Jenny's here to observe us in our natural habitat. So, just ignore her. And I was just over writing in my notebook. And Eli, it's funny because you can't really be around him and not interact with him. I mean, he's not going to ignore you, but he did just kind of get used to me being there and just sort of like quietly hanging out. And one day, I sort of got to the point where then I was friends with them. After a couple of years, it's like, well, I'm not just here observing you, I'm also your friend. And so I just went out to dinner with them once without my notebook. And Eli was like, oh no, you forgot your little notebook. Like he was so horrified that it's like my appendage that I always have. And so they just kind of rolled with it. And, as far as a waiver, we didn't do anything. I just sort of was open with her about what I was doing. And because I had never kind of done something with this level of access and sort of intimacy, I did show her the draft before it went to the publisher. And so that is something that I feel like other journalists are not okay with that. And I was okay with it because it's her life. And, I changed their names, but people who know them are going to know this is them. And so I told her, if there's something in here you can't live with, I'll take it out. And there were a couple of things that she took issue with, and we kind of just talked through them. And one of them was, there's a scene where we're at a family gathering and her uncle uses the R word in front of Eli, and that was really, he didn't seem to even notice, but for her it was a huge deal. And so she was worried about that scene staying in, and would he feel like, you know, he's being vilified. And she brought someone there to like, you know, like a hidden camera show, and now he's looking like the villain. But I said, you know, I think the point is that he's not a villain, and he didn't use this to be mean, or he didn't even think about it as like, I am poking fun at kids with intellectual disabilities. He was just using a word that's very common in New England, and had no idea, you know, as it came out of his mouth, that it could be harmful. And so I felt like that was a point that needed to be made, that like anyone can say this word and really hurt someone's feelings and not even be aware of it. So you know, we just talked through it, and that stayed in.
Karen?
My question is, what does Eli think about having a book published about him?
That is a good question. And he's so nonchalant about it. Even the whole time that I was with them, you know, I explained to him, you know, I'm writing a book about you. And he's like, yeah, great. And I mean, he can read somewhat. He can't really comprehend like a book like this. So he's sort of aware, you know, because we've also like gone, now that after the book came out, we like we did a presentation at one of the Williams Syndrome national conventions, and people would be like, "Oh, you're Eli, like I read about you." He's like, "Yeah, like, he's like, "Of course, yeah, of course, this woman wrote a book about me. Yeah, here I am." So I don't know, it did not faze him, did not impress him much.
Oh, Chris
That's
Butler?
delightful. I love that.
Chris Butler, you want to unmute and give your comment?
Yes. Jennifer, when I've been listening to the audio version of the book and began at ground zero. I had never heard of this syndrome, knew nothing about it. I'm about halfway through, and it's an amazing story. I've really enjoyed your reporting on this. And you were talking about the how this syndrome may have been the source of some mythology. And it made me think of another line from Shakespeare. It's in one of his sonnets, and I thought it fit Eli particularly. Shakespeare wrote of an untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties.
Yep.
But thank you for the book. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was kind of my first reaction when hearing about the disorder. And obviously there's more to it than just the naive sort of trusting openness. But yeah, I mean, in every religion, that's something to aspire to, is being like children and being open and trusting. So yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to say, I think this is in the book a little bit, that like, do they have the disorder or do we have the disorder? And that's obviously an oversimplification, but there's a lot to admire about Eli.
The holy fool.
Mm-hmm.
David Elder?
I was just wondering what your next project is going to be.
Well, I have an idea in mind, and I feel like it's too early to even say it because, you know, one of you guys could steal my idea and then publish it before I do. But so I don't know if I should even say this, but I went to my agent because after this book came out, she was asking that, what's your next book? And I didn't have an idea for a while, and I finally got one, and I just went to her and I said, here's my idea. Aren't you excited? And she was like, well, narrative nonfiction is not, like, I don't think we can sell that right now. It's not popular right now. And no one knows for sure why, but it's just not a genre that people are interested in. And I was like, well, that's a bummer for me because that's all I know how to do. But so I hope that I can tell this. I think it's going to be a great story. She actually recommended you could do it as a podcast. And I said, well, I would have to learn a whole new skill set. And I don't really understand why people would want narrative nonfiction as a podcast and not as a book. Because like Chris, you could just listen to the audiobook and, you know, pretend it's a podcast. That was the first I've heard of it. But then I've talked to other people, and apparently narrative nonfiction is not a big moneymaker. So it turns out I picked the wrong area of specialty.
I immediately thought of podcasts when you said it's not popular. I wonder if it's not popular because people are listening rather than reading those kinds of stories.
Yeah, that was one thing that I heard. And then also because so many people are kind of sharing their personal stories on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and everything. It's like you can get first person access to these stories and not have to go through an intermediary who writes 300 pages about it. So
But what I thought was important about your book is that also you brought in the science, and you talked about how this genetic, because it is a micro deletion, it leads scientists to more information about other disorders because they know where to look, right? And the genome is so large that people got so excited we were going to know everything about it, and it turns out, wow, there's so much we don't even know where to start. But this gave them a focus, which I thought was very interesting.
yeah, and I feel like, you know, that was, well, I mean, really, I started researching the book probably 8 years ago. And so in science, that is a long time. But I just feel like genetics has changed so much since I sort of forced myself to learn genetics to be able to write this book. And now everyone's doing the genome-wide association studies. So you're looking at across the genome, what are the patterns that are correlated with certain behavioral traits. So nobody's really doing this kind of single gene. I think people still are doing it somewhat, but there's not as many good opportunities to do single gene candidate studies now, unless you have something like Williams, where it's already, the gene deletion has already been done for you and you can just observe the effects. But I feel like at the time that I was researching the book, people were looking for single genes that were associated with autism and schizophrenia. And so that was kind of, the hope was that something like Williams would help you, because it's similar to autism, but different from autism. Maybe there's something to look at here. And I feel like that's kind of been abandoned as a way to do genetics.
Julie has some more questions.
I'm full of questions also, because I also write narrative nonfiction. In my case, it's been a travel nonfiction book. But anyway, my question, has been a lot of people talking about whether it's worthwhile doing an MFA nowadays. And in your case, you were clearly an accomplished writer before you went for your MFA. I mean, you were already working as a professional journalist. So how important for you was getting the MFA? And if you do think it was important, what did it help you with, or how did it help you develop as a writer?
It turned out to be, I think, the best decision that I made. And it was funny because, 2 years before I decided to apply for an MFA, I thought that MFAs were a waste of money. And if, like no one can teach you how to write, and all you need to do is, keep writing and then you'll get there. And actually, part of what motivated me to get my MFA was I was disgruntled at my job. And so I was like, well, I don't want to keep, newspapers seemed like they were going off a cliff. And, I was writing things that I didn't think were why I got into journalism, and having to write like multiple stories a day, and they're all 100 words long. So I just was like, well, what's my way out? And so it seemed like, okay, I can go to this MFA program for 3 years and just like have time to figure out what I want to do. And I knew I wanted to write a book. And so I thought, okay, well, that will just sort of buy me some time to work on the book and think about what's next. And then, getting there, I realized I would have never written a book on my own, because if you are working a full-time job, you don't have the bandwidth or the energy or the brain power to then come home and write, especially something that requires, reporting and research. So I really needed that time away from full-time work, and being in an MFA program gave me this supportive community, gave me feedback, it gave me deadlines, because sometimes I would write a chapter as a class assignment. And then it was like, if it's not done by the end of the semester, then you fail grad school. So actually, when I finished my MFA, I only had 150 pages written. And I said, do you guys want me to stay here until I finish it? And they said, no, get out. I was like, well, you don't know how it ends. And they're like, we'll give you your degree and then you can go finish it. So I was able to take my half of a book and pitch it to agents and then get the book deal. And so then I finished it after Simon & Schuster bought it. And that was interesting too, because I mean, there was so much that changed after I got an editor too, and a lot of reworking of how I thought it was going to be. And actually, they were the ones that wanted me to put in a lot more science. Originally, I was just doing the narrative with like a sprinkling of science. And every editor who was interested in the book said, we like this narrative, but it needs like 90% more science. So that was how it kind of came. It's almost, I don't know if it's a 50-50 balance now, but it's a lot bigger than I was originally planning.
So just to one more thing, you don't want to share your next book idea with us because you want someone, I'll run out and write a book and preempt you. But I want to do the reverse. I want to make a suggestion to you. It seems to me that you could take everything you know now and craft a book for children, and particularly for children with this disorder. But other parents might buy it to read to their children too, or to read to their children, or have their children read.
Yeah,
I've done that. I wrote a story about international adoption, but for children, not for the parents. Most of the books are for the parents, but it's nice to give the children their own book too. Anyway, just a suggestion.
yeah, that's a great idea.
Julie's books are great.
Did your editor suggest the format for the book? I really like the way you had, I think maybe one chapter about Eli and Gail, and then the next chapter you would go into the science of the Williams disorder, or maybe a couple of chapters. Anyway, it was kind of alternating, and it made it easier to read. You mentioned The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Another book club I was in read that book, and the biggest complaint about that book was that the first half of it was so interesting because it was about Henrietta Lacks and her family and what happened to her. And then the second half was all the technical stuff. And they said, oh, it was so detailed, they couldn't understand it. And it was all the second half, but because you balanced it, it was easier to just get caught up in her story, read about the disorder, and if it's over my head, I would say, okay, I'm just going to get through this, and then I'll get back to Gail and Eli and how he's doing and how they're doing, and then slog through the technical part again. But I found it just fascinating, and I love the format. Was that an editor decision, or was that just how you set it up?
That was how I set it up. And I guess, another model that I use, I don't know if you guys have read The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by Ann Fadiman. So that was a little bit of a, kind of a model for me too, is that I think she does a really good job of, kind of bite-sized bits of, for her, it was like the history and the cultural context. So yeah, and I really, I think I read my Goodreads reviews, which I shouldn't, but I feel like a lot of people on there say, the narrative parts were interesting, and then I skipped all the boring chapters. And I feel like I can relate to that though, because I hate when authors do, interesting narrative, and then there's like a cliffhanger, and then you have to read about the history of whaling, which is why I skipped all those chapters in Moby Dick. So I can totally identify with people who don't want the science stuff. And that's why I guess I tried to have pity on the people who were going to try to read those chapters and just keep it interesting and fast. But so I hope I did that.
No, but the technical parts were interesting. It was just hard for me to read because I couldn't understand a lot of it. But it was fascinating. And my son-in-law has his family has several sons with autism, and I thought, shouldn't it be easy to go to that family and check all their DNA and track down the autism, the genes, but evidently it's not so easy. And I thought it was fascinating that the Williams disorder is just this micro deletion and they were able to pinpoint it. But with autism, they're still struggling with that. And someone mentioned that because it's a spectrum, it's not one thing specifically. I don't know, but no, I really enjoyed the technical aspect. It was just a little harder to read. And I gave you a 5 on Goodreads.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
I have to say I'm very disappointed to hear that narrative nonfiction is not popular, because I'm dead keen to read more of your writing. And I mean, quite seriously, this was a wonderful book. It was an absolute eye-opener to not only to a particular medical condition, but to the way an author can make a medical condition come so alive through a family and through following that family for an extended period of time. And I've been sitting here trying to think about other ways that material and that kind of writing could be done that would be more accessible to people. But then it occurred to me, there is a lot of narrative nonfiction that's coming out now, maybe not in the same structure as yours, but it all has to do with murderers and serial killers. So clearly, those kinds of mostly psychological problems rather than neurological, they are flavor of the month or disease of the week, as we used to call it. And so they're, without, I don't want to read any more serial killer stuff, but if there's a way that we could hook into something that has attracted people's fancy, then I think you really could find a market for it, because you are that good. And I think it was really a pleasure to read your book. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And this is being recorded, so I can just send this to my agent, right?
That's fine. And I did not get paid for that time.
Well, it's funny that you should say, the psychology, but like the true crime psychology, because that is definitely true. And when I talked to the editor that I worked with, who I love her, she's great, and she did a great job with the book and really made it better. And but we were brainstorming like, well, what could you write about? And she was like, oh, do you know Munchausen by proxy, which I only know because of Law and Order. I feel like that's always on Law and Order. And there was a young woman who, her mother shaved her head and told everyone she had cancer, and then the daughter and her boyfriend murdered the mother, and now she's in prison. And so the editor was like, well, you should do a book about her, because I guess there was like an HBO series about this woman, but there hasn't been a book. So she's like, you can still do the book. And I read some article, like Vanity Fair, somebody did a profile of her, and I just like read the article and I just looked at the pictures of her and her eyes, she's like shark eyes, and I was like, I can't go, I don't want to meet this woman, I don't want to write about her. I need somebody that I can root for, and I can't do somebody who murdered her mom, even though I'm sure she had her reasons.
You probably know this book, but I thought others in the group might be interested in another book that falls into the same genre, is Hidden Valley Road. And it's about a family where multiple siblings have schizophrenia, and they have also used that family as for genetic research, trying to identify, can they find a genetic link to schizophrenia. So it's a pretty interesting book, and it's similarly laid out as to yours, where it's a story of this family, but then there's also the science mixed in.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard of that book. And I another one that I really liked is it's called Is There No Place on Earth for Me? It's by Susan Sheehan. I feel like it won maybe not a Pulitzer, maybe a National Book Award, but it's about a woman with schizophrenia. I think it was written in the 80s, and it was kind of like in the deinstitutionalization era, like where does she go? What can she do? So that's really interesting. I would love to do something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Does anybody have any final questions? We would like to take a picture, so everyone who's willing, if you would turn on your camera, that would be terrific. And thank you very much, Jenny. I think you can see that many of us enjoyed the book, and I'm sure others will go ahead and read it now. So thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know if you guys have access to my email, but like really email me story ideas, and I really appreciate all your feedback.
Okay. I have her email, so if you need it, you can contact me at Society Rice University Women at gmail.com.
Just one last comment is that you made Eli and Gail so likable that you know, I enjoyed reading it. But the thing about Gail was that she was so intense, and I wonder if, once again, if that is why Eli did well, is that she was so proactive, and it just seemed like some of the other mothers at camp were so laid back, and I wonder, you know, if their children end up doing as well as Eli, but once again, there is this kind of a spectrum, so you can't be sure, but she was so proactive and so caring and loving, and
You know,
I just hate her husband for leaving her.
you know,
Yeah, that was another one that we couldn't put into the book, but there's definitely more story there.
yeah.
Oh,
No, she as a pediatrician, this is like the best kind of mother you can have for a child. Well, actually for any child who really focuses in on the child and what the child needs. The sad part is that she lost so much of herself, you know, and wasn't to do that. And you know, that was so revealing in this book, that, you know, because yeah, the mothers have to be pushy, but you don't want them to push too hard, you know, but they have to be pushy. So yeah, no,
Well, she still, you know, she still doesn't have a partner. I mean, she doesn't date because she says, well, I don't have time. Where would that time come from? And it's like, yeah, I mean, you have to also make time for yourself and find fulfillment for yourself. But you know, for her, this works, and this is how she wants it to be. And but it is funny. I mean, she just puts so much time and energy into everything she does for him. And like, you know, she would mention to me, we'd be at these conventions or at like the summer camp, and she's like, well, but where are the other single mothers? Like, I can't be the only single mother of Williams. And I'm like, Bill, they are at home because they're tired. They're working and taking care of a kid. Like, they're not dragging them to Michigan, driving them to Michigan for a week. Like, that's a lot. And that's kind of partly why I was glad that I ended up choosing this family, just because, you know, obviously I clicked with them, but also it was like, I feel like just having me around, even though I didn't do, you know, I wasn't obviously going to take any part in like helping or, you know, definitely not disciplining Eli or helping with the behavioral modification, because I'm just an impartial observer. But I feel like just having another adult around was helpful to her, and maybe, you know, grounding. So yeah, but yeah, it's a lot for her, but I don't think it's going to change. And her plan is just to have him live at home with her forever and never date again. So we'll see.
Okay, I'm going to thank you again so much. That was so great. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who's going to take our pictures.